And we're live. Thank you for coming back for yet another episode. Hey, all you crazy sci-fi and fantasy fans, it's time for your daily dose of shenanigans over here at the Blasters and Blades podcast. Just three nerdy veterans geeking out over our science fiction passions and fantastical fantasies. A place where magic is king, the sky is the limit, and space is the place. The podcast that puts the fun in dysfunction. So without further ado, I'm going to remind you that yet again, I'm running solo. Doc has lost her voice at the Mighty Dragon Con this year. And Garber is still trying to dry out. Apparently, he fell off his boat. I don't know. We won't ask too many questions. I'm sure the answers would be embarrassing anyway. But instead, I'm just going to introduce you to my guest, Mr. D.G.D. Davidson. We call him Deej for short. But can you please introduce yourself to our listeners and viewers?
Well, hello. I am an archaeologist, librarian, science fiction geek, magical girl anime fan, and also an author. I have 3 novels out so far, and I'm working furiously on others. And am excited to be able to talk about it with you here today.
All right. In the next part of that introduction, dear listeners, how we found them. So you're going to get sick of hearing this, but he's one of the last ones that came to us via Declan Finn over on the Twitters. So friend of the show, Declan, hooked us up, and we're going to have to start doing people that don't know Declan just for a change of pace next month. But, we don't look a gift horse in the mouth. Speaking of looking a gift horse in the mouth, we can't let you stay, sir, until you answer the religion question. So,
Okay.
Star Wars, Star Trek, or Firefly?
I may not answer that exactly the way that you want. My own opinion, I know this may be contrary to this may be you call it a religion question, so this may be unorthodox or heretical. My view of stories is I really like them contained. I like self-contained narratives. I like complete narratives. I like contained universes. I really like the original Star Wars trilogy, and I have frankly never really been interested in looking very much at all into the expanded universe or prequels and sequels and so forth. And something I would say similar about Star Trek. I love the original series. I kind of feel that it went off the rails after that part, starting already with the movies. Let's see, what was the next one? Firefly. I did very much enjoy Firefly, and I guess that is in a way more self-contained. If it has any expanded universe or so forth, I'll follow up on it, though. Also, I guess I admit I thought that one went off the rails with the movie that finished it off, though, and perhaps in a sense it had to, since it got canceled and they had to wrap it up pretty quickly, if at all. If you're asking me which one of those I think is superior to the others, I might have to pass. I'm not sure I have a thought on that, because I appreciate all 3 of them for what they are in different ways. They're different approaches to the space opera, and I respect all 3 of them.
So you're going to be a Trinitarian. You like all 3 for different reasons.
We'll say that. Trinitarian, if that's it.
I don't know if it's a word, but if it isn't, we just made it up, and we're going to rock it out.
It is a word. It usually refers to something else, but...
Okay. And because we're polytheistic here at the sci-fi... Nope. I got the name wrong again. I'm going to start having to owe people money when I do that. But we here at the Blasters and Blades, it's only been 2 years since we rebranded. You'd think I'd get it right. But because we're polytheistic, Game of Thrones, Lord of the Rings, or Wheel of Time?
We're definitely going to have to go with Lord of the Rings on that one, and probably for a similar reason. Of course, Game of Thrones is incomplete and may forever be incomplete for all we know. Wheel of Time, I will admit, I've looked at it on the shelf, looked at it good and hard, and just saw how many volumes there were, and kind of said to myself, nah. I won't deny that. I know, again, that might make me a heretic here, but I really appreciate Lord of the Rings. Although, again, my belief in contained narratives, I've never been able to get excited about the rest of the Legendarium, whether it be the Silmarillion or any of the various. Did I just use the wrong? No, I didn't. Or any of the various books that were published more recently. I do think both The Hobbit as an excellent children's novel, and then as The Lord of the Rings as a more adult expansion on that same world are excellent. But a lot of the rest of that, I admit, never really was able to get me excited, even though I can certainly, in a intellectual or academic standpoint, can appreciate the work and the genius that went into creating all of it. But my love of the complete and contained story has perhaps somewhat limited my appreciation of those really sprawling fantasy worlds.
So would you say you prefer standalones or just smaller contained series? So like a trilogy, would you read that, or is that too
Oh, I would absolutely
expansive?
read a trilogy, and it's not as if I'm unable to appreciate a story that keeps going and going. It's more that I think by the time I noticed Wheel of Time, it was already so large that I never began it, simply because there have always been other things higher on my list of desired reads. And I know, of course, it is now finally complete. I'll also admit, when it comes to, say, Song of Ice and Fire, a lot of the things I've heard about it from people who I respect make it sound really nihilistic and like something I might not enjoy. Maybe I would actually if I attempted it, but I never have, to be honest. So.
Okay. So we here at the Blasters and Blades podcast, see, I got it right this time, people, like both the fantastical and the scientific. So what was your first love, sci-fi or fantasy?
That is a good question. And I think my first love would probably have been something of a blend of both, because when I was a kid, when I first really discovered that I was a sci-fi or fantasy geek, the author who really interested me, and also who I was trying to imitate, like, say, back in middle school when I was first began writing, first began attempting my own stories and my own novels, most of which, of course, were very bad at that age, naturally enough. But the man who really interested me was Ray Bradbury. And of course, Ray Bradbury was never hard when it came to his science fiction. He was always more of a kind of almost a lyrical storyteller who's more like evoking moods and painting word paintings than he was attempting to give any kind of realistic portrayal of space travel or anything like that. So he's usually named as a science fiction author, but you could as easily call his work fantasy, since actual science, real science, was never exactly his interest. And I think I would say something that's similar about my own work. That's probably at least something that I have taken away from him, is kind of maybe a blending of science fiction and fantasy, with less of a concern with scientific accuracy and more of a concern with bigger ideas of a more philosophical sense. I'm more of a humanities guy than a science guy myself. So.
Okay. That's a well thought out answer. So what is your first memory of engaging in speculative fiction as a genre? Was it watching something on the television, reading a book, comic, playing a video game? Like, how did you discover spec fic?
It seems like I have been interested in these genres for so long, it's actually kind of hard to pick out a first memory. But I do have a vague memory, although I couldn't tell you exactly what age I would have been. It would have been somewhere back in elementary school. I remember when I was a kid, a lot of the books that were being pushed at me tended to be more realistic fiction. I think Beverly Cleary was a pretty popular author when I was a kid. I mean, I mean no insults toward Beverly Cleary, but I really did not like her work when I was a kid. It just didn't interest me. She wrote stories about ordinary kids doing ordinary things. And that was her genre, and I know there was an audience for that, but I didn't like it at all. I wanted something more exciting, more fantastic that I couldn't really define. Something similar happened when I read, say, the Hardy Boys. I was always disappointed when their mysteries got solved, and they'd start out with something that looked supernatural, and then it would turn out actually to be something very ordinary. And to me, that was a big letdown. It wasn't, aha, the mystery is solved, everything made sense. It was just more like, oh, really? Is that all there is? I'm disappointed by that. And there was a book called City Beyond the Clouds, which I believe is volume 7 of the Great Marvel series. I don't think I'm even the one who found it. It was probably my brother who checked it out at random from the public library. It was a boys' adventure series in terms of its rather poor writing style. It was very similar to like a Hardy Boys novel. But, it starts out with, this fantastic airship crashes into a lake, and the two boys, who are just like the Hardy Boys, except different types of adventures, rescue this man from this downed craft. And he reveals that he came from this planetoid that's hidden in Earth's shadow, and his daughter has been kidnapped by an evil race of red dwarves. So they build a new aircraft to fly up to this planetoid, and they load up on guns, and they're fighting monsters and giant grasshoppers and evil dwarves and all this stuff. And, to me as a kid looking for fantastic things that I didn't really know how to describe or define, this was absolutely mind-blowing. This was like a life-changing book to me at that age. And it was from that point forward, I learned both that there do in fact exist the kind of books that I wanted to read. And I was from that point avidly hunting for that kind of literature. I now actually own a set of the Great Marvel series. They were given to me as a graduation gift some years ago. And that was actually when I found out that there was actually a whole series of these, and it wasn't a standalone book. I also, of course, found as an adult that they're not nearly as good as they seemed to me as a kid, but nonetheless, those were what I could call a life-changing book. Great Marvel Volume 7. So
I'm not gonna lie, that interests me even now. Now the execution's another story, but
I will say, if you want to read Great Marvel, the greatest one in the series, I think, is the one that comes right before that one. It's called On a Torn Away World, which is also its closest to having any real science in it. It's about a super volcano that blasts a giant piece of Alaska into space, and they're trying to survive on this chunk of land that's been knocked into orbit. So I say it comes closest to having any real science in it. Not that it's actually very realistic at all, but
so you're saying it's not NASA approved, huh?
I'm pretty sure that they all would have probably just died from being blasted off into orbit by the super volcano. But the attempt to describe how temperature changes and sunrise and sunset and kind of the wildly differences in gravity and things like that, we're at least making a pretty good attempt for what is otherwise a series that's kind of worshipful of science but doesn't actually know any.
Okay. So what is it, speaking of speculative fiction and worshiping it, what is it about the genre that you love so much?
As a kid, I certainly couldn't have defined it, and I'm not even sure I can define it now. And of course, I no longer have that detestation for more ordinary stories. My reading is certainly more eclectic now than it was when I was a child, but I think it really takes you out of yourself. It takes you out of your surroundings, your settings, shows you possibilities, activates your imagination in perhaps a way that stories of more normal circumstances don't. And I think, you even see a lot of so-called literary works will often incorporate fantasy elements just because, they need that to make a certain plot work or convey a certain kind of theme. Or we can look at folklore or epic poetry or all the different types of literature where the fantastic seems to be a necessary part of our storytelling. There's something in us that demands that, and I don't really know if I could define it or explain it, or if anybody really can. But there does seem to be something in us that yearns for it, and whether that's just a religious impulse or because we have really active imaginations, I don't think I'm equipped to say, but. I think it is a fundamental need, and maybe just in some of us, we pursue it more relentlessly or in different ways from others. Again, it was something I loved and wanted as a child, and that, in a sense, has never left me.
Okay. So how did your love of speculative fiction as a genre transition into you going, man, I really like reading these stories, to, hey, why don't I try telling some of my own?
I think, again, Ray Bradbury was a big influence on that. And a lot of that simply had to do with his style of prose. I mean, up to that point when I discovered him, and when I discovered him was probably somewhere between 5th and 7th grade. I couldn't tell you exactly when I found Ray Bradbury, but it was really the way he wrote and the way he could evoke an image with his words and give you this real picture of what he's describing. He's even got some stories that are almost nothing except a description of a scene. Some of his stories are quite simple plot wise. I think it was really an attempt to copy his style that got me writing in the first place. And of course, what that produced in like 7th grade was some very overwrought, almost unreadable descriptions, 7 pages writing about a sunset or something. But what I think that did help me with, even though of course those early attempts were quite poor, is it eventually led me into a style of my own that is still, I think, fairly descriptive, say, compared to your typical novel style today. Still a fairly descriptive style, but also my own style, and no longer attempt to imitate somebody else. I think I learned that from him, though there were a lot of other things I had to begin learning from other places, like plot structure and characterizations, things that Bradbury was never really heavily focused on, since theme and style were kind of his strongest points.
Okay, so are any of those early works available for readers to track down if they were so inclined?
No, I don't think I would show anybody something I wrote in middle school unless I completely rewrote it. I had one novel I was attempting to write in middle school that I have sometimes crossed my mind that the premise might be interesting enough to do something with. I was actually shocked when the movie Avatar came out, because it was almost my novel exactly that I was writing in middle school, with a few differences. Even the whole action sequence with the floating rocks that didn't really make any sense. I looked at that and said, either he was reading my mind, or I was just writing something really cliched, and so someone was going to eventually do it anyway. I don't know. You can take that how you want to see it, I guess.
Okay, so many many authors will let their real life stories or their real life experiences influence the stories they tell. So, were there any formidable moments that you think shaped you as a creative?
It's interesting. I do let all kinds of things from my experience into my books, whether it's something I just happen to have read somewhere and said, oh, that's really interesting, I want to use that, or something I've personally experienced, or people I know and kind of their personality quirks. For this particular novel, I drew very heavily on culture and religion and mythology from India. I spent a couple of months there, and my personal experience just out on the street and trying to absorb scenes and seeing the colors, the clothing, the smells, the vehicles rushing past. Some of those direct experience went straight into the book with some of the street scenes that appear in this. And I think really, if I hadn't gone there, I think the book probably would not have quite as much color or quite as much vividness as it probably would have otherwise. Certainly, it's possible to write without very much personal experience. Jules Verne wrote great adventure stories without ever leaving France. But there's definitely something to be said from personal experience as well. Speaking of like adventure fiction set in India, another good example of that is Talbot Mundy's King of the Khyber Rifles. There's a scene early in that book in which he's in a train station, and I think you can just tell this is Mundy describing his own experience of being in a Delhi train station. And as the movie moves to, or not movie, as the book moves to more fantastical scenes, I think some of that vividness kind of naturally gets lost. And I think it's that personal experience that really goes in there. I kind of thought the same thing some years back. There was a novel that was co-written by Buzz Aldrin, and now I cannot remember the other author's name, Barnes, and I cannot think of his first name now. But some of the scenes of going into space and the way he describes that I think it was very different from probably what most of us who've never been to space would typically say. He actually describes it as, I didn't think to be all wondrous about the fact that I'm leaving the Earth or all that, because I'm too busy, managing the controls and getting messages back and forth from ground control. And I thought it sounded actually very mundane, but in such a way that probably only somebody who's actually done it could have come up with that. Was kind of the impression it had given me at the time. I seem to think, at least, that I see that sometimes in books I read. You can see these little hallmarks of personal experience. Same thing with Moby Dick. Some of those incredibly vivid scenes in there probably would not be there if the author did not have some of the personal experiences that he had. So, and I try to let that go into my own work as well. Since I've seen how that benefits others, I do try to draw from personal experience. And I am very grateful I got to spend some time in India in the case of writing this particular one, because I think it really did improve it.
So, did you go to India just for this book, or just happened to be happenstance?
I definitely. It was this book that motivated the trip. I was there on kind of a what do they call it? A kind of a voluntourism trip. I was volunteer teaching English in an elementary school there, and also visiting some of the surrounding areas of where I was. So I do kind of wish I had been able to take perhaps a more extensive trip and see more of the country. But I think even with what I did get to see and what I did get to visit, it played a major role in the final version of this novel.
Okay. So transitioning away from the writing side, let's talk about things from a fan angle. Okay. Have you gotten any cool fan art or had anybody cosplay your characters?
I am afraid not, though. If somebody did, they could send it to me over at my blog or through my newsletter link. So.
Okay, we will link that in the show notes.
For this particular book, if you want to dress like my main character, just putting on maybe a really frilly ball gown with a bell-shaped skirt and carrying a couple of handguns in your hands would almost be enough to dress up as this main character. My previous novel, Jake and the Dynamo, if I saw somebody trying to cosplay as Pretty Dynamo, I think that would be impressive. But probably as long as you can do the fancy what do they call that? Like I think goth Lolita is what it's sometimes called. That style would probably be almost sufficient to cosplay my protagonist from this one.
I'm just not sure I got the legs to pull off that kind of dress. Sorry.
Well, I don't either, so it's all right. I don't have the waistline to pull it off. I know that much.
Yeah, me either. But I'll get there someday. Still not pulling it off, but maybe. All right. So since you started writing, I know you're relatively new at the writing side of things, but has anybody asked for your autograph yet since you started writing?
I have mostly local people in my area, but I have given a few autographs. So.
Do you remember the first time somebody asked you what that experience was like?
Well, it's if I really go back to the first autograph I gave, it would probably be my mom or somebody. But the first time it was somebody I didn't know. I was recently at a little fair or festival and in Oklahoma where I had a booth, and I did have people there asking for autographs along with the books they picked up, and I thought that was pretty exciting. In part, it was exciting just because of how many people came and showed interest. It's always been kind of my understanding that, unless you're number one New York Times bestseller, authors' booths are generally desolate places. But I actually got quite a lot of traffic and intend to go back there next year. And I'm definitely going to have to bring more stock as well. I ran out of books pretty quickly when I was there. So.
You are already doing better, apparently, according to the recent reports than most trad pubs. The recent report with the Random House Law was I think the average book sells 12 copies.
I think I did see that, but I'm not sure I quite understood what the number was. Was that actually trad pub, or was that as a whole?
That was the specifically traditionally published books, and what it is most of the people never find out about those books because they push so heavily on the big names that if you're not a big name, people have to accidentally stumble into a corner and find your book laying there before they know it exists, kind of thing.
I don't actually know my exact numbers, but I'm confident I've sold more than 12. So I guess
Yeah, I'm
I can
pretty
say
sure I
I'm
beat
above
12
average.
too.
I'm above average. I can at least put that. I'll put that up on a header somewhere. Above average
Yeah,
author.
confidently above average.
There you go. Confidently above average author, D.G.D. Davidson.
Yeah, that's recruiting poster material right there. So finally, what's the weirdest or funniest interaction you've had with a fan? Obviously, keeping it family friendly since you started writing.
Yeah, well, the weirdest, and again, have not had probably enough to give you a really eccentric story, but speaking of family friendly, the one that kind of made me nervous, where I just had a woman come up to me and tell me that her young daughter, her 11-year-old daughter, was really enjoying my books. That made me a little bit nervous, just because so far the work that I've written, I don't really consider as being aimed specifically at kids, even though I tend to write child protagonists. The books themselves are actually written geared for a more adult audience. Although that interaction did get me to thinking, and also my experience too at this little festival that I was at, where most of the people who were coming to my booth and showing interest were in fact kids. That I really would like to produce something that's more family friendly, more child oriented. So I am actually working on a sword and sorcery a novel at present that's more geared toward the younger reader. I have a few picture book ideas also jostling around in my head, though I haven't entirely decided what to do with them as yet. But at the moment, in addition to a sequel of one of my other existing books, I'm working on something that's more for the kiddos, partly because of interaction with parents, and also just because of the number of children who've shown interest in my work.
So you'll have to definitely come back when you get those out, because that'd be an interesting conversation.
All right.
So speaking of your other works, can you give us the Reader's Digest version of your body of work? What all have you written?
Well, as I mentioned, I have 3 books currently published. My first 2 are 2 books in the series called Jake and the Dynamo. They're a post-apocalyptic magical girl comedy series, action comedy, about a hapless young man who finds himself in the company of a girl with superpowers, who's the only one who can keep him alive, while the monsters who are trying to decimate humanity are targeting him specifically. Lots of slapstick humor. It's largely a kitchen sink fantasy humor book. Basically, anything I think is funny goes in there and becomes a joke. Almost anything in terms of fantastical elements can kind of fit into its world. It's a world where space aliens and gods and ghosts can all kind of butt heads with each other, and so they end up fighting or dealing with most everything: ancient conspiracies and attacks by alien robot dinosaurs, and most everything else. It's been really a fun series, and it's gotten some positive responses. My most recent novel, the one I'm personally most excited about, and which also definitely required the most legwork in order to produce, is this one, Rags and Muffin, that you have on the video feed shown up there. This takes place in a world that's built around Indian culture and mythology. It's almost a kind of condensed pseudo-India in a single city. But the central premise is that humans share the earth alongside another race called the Marjara, who are sort of a cat-like species, but they're able to interbreed, and their offspring are young girls. If they interbreed, are girls who are able to produce religious mystical experiences on demand, which leads to them being worshipped as living goddesses. But at the same time, they have a gland in the back of their heads that produces a hallucinogenic drug that's valuable on the black market. So they're both worshipped and also exploited. And the main character is one of these girls who, for rather complicated and esoteric reasons, has gained great strength and fighting ability, and has gathered together a team and works to rescue other girls who are being sold on the black market. The central story is a rescue operation that goes horribly wrong, and the main characters adventure trying to get in and out with someone they are attempting to rescue. There's enormous amounts of fighting. I'd say probably about 2/3 of the book is action, and much of the rest is world building and giving you a tour of this universe and building the book. And it's also is set up for a sequel as well. So I am working on turning it into a series.
Okay, that sounds definitely interesting, and we'll space these out because obviously we don't want to do all back to back. But I'd be interested to talk about that one too. I know humor is difficult to write, especially when you have to consider everything needs double, sometimes triple meanings. It can be a lot of work, especially when you're someone whose humor is never left 12th grade or the barracks or however you want to describe infantry humor. But I submitted a story once to a humor anthology, and they're like, "Yeah, this is too vulgar for us." I'm like, "Oh, okay." So I published it myself, but I was like, "I'm never doing this again." Obviously, that all sounds fascinating, but if you look by the low connectivity, so there's no image on the screen today, you've been looking at his book cover the whole time. So we're here to talk about Rags and Muffin. So what's the origin story for this novel? Like, how did you come up with the premise for it?
It's kind of, man, it seems like I've been working on this so intently. I've kind of forgotten what some of the sources of many of these things were. I think there are probably 6 things that inspired the concepts, the plot, and all the different things that are in it. An interest, fascination with Indian culture, a love for adventure novels, and probably Talbot Mundy and Rudyard Kipling are probably the biggest inspirations in this case. I also discovered through my work as I began researching for this the existence of an actual practice of worshiping young girls as living goddesses, especially in the Buddhism of Nepal, although there's also a Hindu practice somewhat similar. I ended up incorporating a lot of that into my depiction of these girls in this book. A lot of anime and kung fu movies. I won't deny actually went into many of the ideas in here. There's a lot of martial arts fighting. There's some giant robots around as well. But also probably one of the most influential things, albeit indirectly, is probably the philosophy of Timothy Leary and his idea of taking psychedelic drugs as kind of a shortcut to a mystical religious experience. I don't believe I've ever actually read anything by Leary, but I know as an undergraduate, I kind of absorbed some of his ideas through some writers such as John Hick and Houston Smith. And, never terribly had much interest in that direction, but that kind of came back to me as I was working on this particular book. And I think that kind of informs that you have on the one hand, these girls that can offer these experiences, but that means in a sense, putting yourself in their power, or then there's people who are actually exploiting them for drugs, kind of getting the shortcut. And I think that maybe in a sense is somewhat analogous to real life where, people who have, intense mystical experiences usually achieve them through very lengthy process of self-discipline and self-denial. And I think one of the reasons that Timothy Leary's ideas probably appealed to a lot of people is because he was suggesting you can have this through self-indulgence instead, that here's an easy path, just drop LSD and you can see God, essentially, is what he was promising people. And again, I don't think I had any great longstanding interest in him or his ideas, but I found that became part of the stew that ended up going into the book, and so is kind of lurking in there as one of its major themes.
Okay, and before we get too deeply into this novel, we're at that point of the episode, dear listeners, where we pause for a moment and we are going to shamelessly shill for the man. So thank you, Jonathan Yanez, and we appreciate your sponsorship. If this thing will play for us, and go.
Grab your swords and get ready to level up. When gaming journalist Ray experiences a tragic accident with the next generation of gaming consoles, he finds himself stuck in the mystical land of Valka. Trapped in a world filled with magic beasts, warring factions, filthy bandits, and a level system that's out of this world. The only problem is, his only way out may be through. Ray must fight like his life depends on it, because it just may. Survival means victory, and defeat could mean the end. Forever. Legends Online Genesis releases on Audible January 7th. Digital and hard copies now available on Amazon.
All right, thank you for sticking with us. And I just realized we got to get them to update that commercial because it's already out now.
All right.
But we appreciate that sponsorship, Jonathan. But before we dig into the novel any deeper, we're going to take a moment to talk about that image on the screen. So, what is the story for this this glorious image? Normally, we call it sexy book covers, but she looks a little young for that word, so we're just going to call it glorious.
Glorious book covers. Yes. Well, that is a picture of Rags and Muffin. That's Rags in the front, and Muffin is the creature with her there. Rags is the protagonist of this book. She is a 12-year-old girl, though her pediatrician is filling her with a stew of drugs that is actually left her somewhat younger looking. Her creature with her there is called a dragon dog, and his name is Muffin because she got to name him. But he is a fallen demigod who is being punished by being made a companion for young children. He is currently bonded with young Rags, and one of the requirements of his exile is that he has to play whatever game she wants to play. And the game that she wants to play is fighting bad guys in real life. And so he is her constant companion. He's also the driver in the story. He likes to steal cars and is able to operate them, and is also an alcoholic. So she has an alcoholic carjacking dog that accompanies her on her various misadventures.
Just what every parent wants in a babysitter.
Yeah, I think you might not want Muffin looking after your kids. He can talk, but only children can hear him. So the adults are none the wiser about their conversations.
Maybe that's for the best.
It might be.
So let's move on to the book itself. What would your 30-second elevator pitch for this novel be?
Oh gosh, I think I've given it already, but this is what would happen if Talbot Mundi drank a whole lot of whiskey while watching anime and then pounded out a novel afterwards. This is action, adventure, lots of, we'll call it kung fu, basically. I use a different word in the book, but lots of kung fu fighting, lots of magitech technology. There's lots of demon-possessed robots that drag people off to hell. There's lots of very vicious villains, child heroes fighting them. I view this in a way as I hate to use the word deconstruction because I'm not very fond of the concept, although it always seems to be what I end up doing when I write. I might call this a deconstruction of Saturday morning cartoons where kids get up and go to school and then turn around and fight villains and save the world. It's similar to that, but one thing that kind of dissatisfied me, at least as an adult, when I see those kinds of shows or read those kinds of comics, is that the villains are usually pushovers. They're kind of nice villains, the kind of villains you don't mind hanging around your kids too much. And Rags and Muffin is based around more the idea of kids going up against villains who are actually really nasty, really tough people. And the kids, because of the particular powers that they have been endowed with and the equipment that they have access to, are physically prepared to take on these villains, but they're not really psychologically and mentally prepared. And so many of Rags's companions come out of these encounters quite battered, both physically and psychologically as a result.
I would be worried if they didn't come out battered psychologically after that.
But yes, but it's again, it's kind of a take on those types of stories. I'm probably thinking mostly of Kim Possible when I think of this. I don't really think that was one of my direct inspirations, but I did watch it at one point and at least noted some similarities. Her villains are kind of silly, kind of not too G-rated kind of villains, and this is very different from that. These are pretty bad people that they're actually going up with, and Rags herself seems to be almost invulnerable to anything that comes her way, but she drags a lot of other kids along with her who have a very tough time coping with it.
Okay. So what do you think makes this series special?
Well, I think that's an unusual take on the idea of the child hero, and I got an early review from Reedsy that made kind of the same point, that noted that this is maybe even kind of a risky endeavor, that it's a book with children for the main characters, but is very clearly aimed at an adult readership. Obviously, that's not unheard of, but I think when it's done, it's probably more often done in kind of artsy novels where you have these very quiet children who are wise beyond their years or something to that effect. This is a book where the kids are not wise beyond their years. They are physically powerful beyond their years, or indeed beyond normal ability. But in terms of their minds, in terms of their ability to strategize, all of that are still very much children and behave like children. And that also gives me an opportunity for some more cutesy scenes and some humor, in addition to the violent action that characterizes probably the bulk of the novel. So I think it is. I think it's unusual also in that way. Also the setting. There's a very, I don't know if I'm allowed to call my own book rich. Maybe that's going too far, but a setting that I think anyway is quite rich in the development of its lore, its background. You'll see a lot of very, very colorful street scenes, and I'm really trying to evoke all the smells and the bustle and everything that is going on. Again, drawing in to some extent to my own visit to India. So I think in terms of setting, in terms of the arguably somewhat risky concept, I think I'm not aware of anything precisely like it.
Okay. All right. So which tropes do you feel like Rags and Muffin hits the best?
See, I'm not sure I'm really good at thinking in terms of tropes. I've spent some times on the TV Tropes website, as probably just about everybody has, but it's a little hard to know how to pick that out of your book. Well, something that I've kind of been interested in for a while is kind of these. I tend to watch a lot of. There's something I could probably geek out a little different from the questions you asked me at the beginning of the podcast. I'm kind of interested in magical girl anime. Again, my other series, Jake and the Dynamo, is basically a magical girl series. Rags and Muffin, I say, is somewhat similar, except kind of those real obvious, like anime inspired tropes are more backgrounded. There are some giant robots in them, but there's a good chance you won't think of anime as you're reading this particular book. And so the central idea of a young girl who's very powerful and carries weapons and so forth is to some degree drawn from that. I also think I've put a different spin on it from what's seen usually, especially incorporating those ideas of the Nepalese, Kumari worshiping aspect of their religion. I'm not quite sure what noun to finish that sentence off with, but incorporating those religious ideas and blending them with this type of character, I think makes that an unusual take on that kind of that idea. I think maybe at the time I first started this, because admittedly this is in a sense my first novel, even though I have other novels published. This was something I was working on before, so it became something that I was working on for an unreasonably long amount of time. But I feel like when I started this, Action girls were perhaps not as common as they are now. So it's perhaps a little difficult now to say that I've got a strong female character, and that's what makes it unique. The age of the character, the incorporated themes, the incorporated cultural motifs, I think do make this an unusual character and an unusual setting that she's in.
Okay. So what about genres or subgenres? Obviously, this sounds like fantasy. I would say you've already said it's action adventure. Are there any other genres or subgenres that this fits into?
I like to call it dungeon punk, but I'm not sure that word ever really took off. I think Magitech became the more popular way to describe what I've got in here. This analogous to steampunk, but it's technology powered by magic rather than powered by steam, which is treated as magic, which is what steampunk typically is. One of the characteristics of this, there's a technology in here that's basically machines that are possessed by demons that operate the machines essentially. And if the machines break, the demons, before flying back to hell, will try to grab anyone they can and drag them down with them. And that becomes a recurring danger hazard during some of the action scenes of these machines being destroyed and attempting to drag people to hell. It seems almost like the technology wouldn't be worth the risk, but in any case, there are apparently people in this world who think it is. So it has that, again, I like to call it dungeon punk. It has that dungeon punk or Magitech aspect as a major part of the world.
Okay. So let's talk about the story itself. Other than what you've already told us about Rags and Muffin, what would you say makes the main character unique?
I like to describe her as Fancy Nancy with guns and kung fu, but I'm not sure if most people know who that character is. It's actually a series of picture books I've been reading to my little daughter, who's a toddler. But and honestly, again, that was something that didn't directly inspire this novel. Something I discovered afterwards. My wife pointed out to me, your character is a lot like Fancy Nancy, and I thought, she is. She likes her pretty dresses. She likes her tea parties. She loves her dogs. She also really, really likes to hurt bad people and happens to have the power to do so. I think that combination of her kind of a sweet, innocent aspect, and at the same time, she's very angry at injustice, but has a child's idea of what justice should look like, which consists of little more than seriously injuring people she considers to be in the wrong. She's not wrong; they are in the wrong. I mean, the people she's going after are in fact very bad people. But and that was difficult, I think, at first, and finally figuring out how to structure her character in a way where these two aspects of her made sense. Took a lot of work, and some early drafts of the book. It was almost like I'd hit an action scene and she'd like turn to wood. It's like I couldn't make her move. Like I was trying to force her around the page, and I had to go back and think about her character and think about, why does she behave this way, and how does it make sense in the way that she's not just schizophrenic, like she's a sweet girl on the one hand and a rage goblin on the other. And I think what I finally came up with that actually made it work was actually giving her a no-kill rule. I used to hate no-kill rules for superheroes. I thought they were artificial, but I reached a point where I realized Rags needed one. And suddenly her character made sense to me, and those two aspects of her personality suddenly gelled together when I realized that she's not a little murderous. She's very violent. She's a young assault and battery committer, but not a murderess.
Sounds like she needs some time out and a nap.
She might. Probably the people she's after need a timeout more than she does, but but that is a part of her. She is very angry as well as a sweet little girl. And I think in a way, kids are capable of that, especially, I mean, she's not a toddler anymore, but little toddlers can go back and forth between really happy and sweet to just really upset because they've got those emotions they haven't learned how to control yet. I think in a way Rags is similar to that. She can go back and forth very naturally from very happy to very angry and lashing out, because in a way she does not have an adult self-control.
Do we ever discover how old she is exactly?
She is exactly 12, although again her doctor's been manipulating her with various chemicals and such that have essentially stopped her aging process. Again, that kind of ties into some other plot elements in the book of exactly why he's doing that. And actually, well, I might as well tell you, the reason he's doing that is because these hybrids, these girls who are half human and half Marjara, in addition to being living goddesses who can produce these mystical experiences on demand, also have very short lifespans. Their maximum age is 16, at which point they simply sicken and die. This pediatrician of Rags's is conducting essentially illegal experiments, trying to find ways to extend their lifespans. And he's basically turned her into a little experimental subject. So.
Okay. So were there any secondary characters which were especially memorable to you?
I think the character that to me was probably the most, let's say, easiest to write is probably Rag's most immediate sidekick, Nicky. Nicky is a 14-year-old boy, and all these kids have medical problems, by the way. Rags, of course, has a limited lifespan thing. And then Nicky has a glycogen storage disease. I actually knew what I wanted his symptoms to be, and I hunted and hunted until I found a disease that actually matched what I wanted. He has glycogen storage disease type 0 specifically, which basically means his body does not store energy properly. And he's a very competent fighter. He's almost as skilled as Rags is in hand-to-hand combat, but he has to eat almost constantly or he can't keep his energy up. That also plays an important part of the story, where basically Nicky is going to pass out, and these kids are, and if he passes out, he can eventually go into a coma and die. And while these kids are basically trapped and not able to get him any food and so forth, that forms part of the tension of the book, the time limit surrounding Nicky's particular condition. Nicky's himself a very angry character, though in a different way from Rags. He's quite sullen. That made him both kind of challenging to write, but I felt also in a way kind of very natural. And he's kind of the first character you meet that kind of shows what a toll following Rags actually has on these kids. Another one who to me was probably the most interesting to write was the Lady Jean, who is actually a 10-year-old girl who has a fairly severe case of central precocious puberty. She actually looks considerably older than she actually is because of early maturation. Again, all of them have different medical issues, but she's actually the double agent on the team. She's secretly working with a terrorist organization that is trying to get information about Rags. I say secret, but it's revealed fairly early on, so that's not giving away too much. But her background of how this organization basically broke her mentally was, I think, very intense to write. Required some research. I was actually buying books on child soldiers and kind of the real life horror of that to get an impression of how to construct her character. I also ended up giving her, based on a real case I had read about of a child experiencing trauma and attempting to cope with it, as she is developing. It's not quite full blown, but she's yet, because she's still young, but developing a condition called oral sadism, essentially where she cuts herself and drinks her own blood to make her feel better whenever she's dealing with trauma that she doesn't know how to handle otherwise. Again, kind of an intense character to write. I thought, to me personally, one of the most fascinating characters to explore in the book. But again, like I said before, these kids are all struggling to deal with these things that they're being exposed to that they're really not ready for.
Okay. So obviously you've mentioned that there's a bad guy in this. So what can you tell us without giving us any spoilers about the bad guys?
Well, for this first volume, the bad guys are you might say relatively low level. There's various bad guys who get encountered, but the one who forms kind of a centerpiece of this particular novel is a man named Velasquez, who is running a brothel and opium den and has recently acquired one of these girls off the black market for the intention of exploiting her for the drug that's in the back of her head. So he and his henchmen are kind of the primary villains in this book, though we're also encountering some other villains who will be of more importance later, who Rags has some encounters and battles with. But Velasquez himself and the guys surrounding him are the main villains. I tried to make him at least slightly sympathetic. There's a point in there where ends up with making some mistakes, having various people after him. Another mafia basically is after him, as well as Rags, and ends up basically telling the prostitutes working for him that they're free to go and that he won't try to hunt them down for escaping from them or anything like that. I tried to give him that little bit of moment of sympathy where he shows some concerns for others, even though his life is basically built around exploiting people. Some of his henchmen also, I tried to give some different interesting traits. There's one of them who's depicted as very kind of gentle and sympathetic toward this girl who's been kidnapped and is trying to treat her well. Or on the other hand, there's another guy who's basically a sadistic pedophile who's not sympathetic at all. And those two characters are kind of set in a sort of contrast with each other among the henchmen of this main villain. So, and there are some others as well, some heavies who have cool martial arts moves and so forth. So he's got a collection of those, and then also a side villain who's directly related to the main villain, who builds some of these demon possessed robots, which also fit into the action sequences at one point as well. And yeah, we'll go with that.
Okay, so speaking of,
lost my thread there somewhat, but
no, you did good. You did good. So speaking of characters, if yours met you in a dark alley and they knew who you were the Mr. Davidson who made their life hell. How do you see that interaction playing out for you?
It's tough. I mean, if it was, let's see, if it was Nicky, I don't know if he'd actually start beating me up or if he'd just cuss at and scream at me. Actually, the latter seems more in keeping with his personality. Rags, I'm trying to think of what exactly her reaction would be. Well, if she knew that I was the one who was making people's life hell, since her philosophy is to beat up people who do bad things to others, I think I would probably not fare very well if I had a direct encounter with her. I'd probably come out of it with some limbs broken, at the very least. So Rags would probably not be the one I'd want to encounter. At first, I was thinking, well, maybe meeting Rags. No, I think she'd hurt me.
Since we talked about characters, do you have a favorite character archetype? Do you think in those terms when you write your novels?
I don't really think in terms of archetypes. I've been known sometimes to use the word motif, which I guess sometimes means more or less the same thing without the psychological baggage. But I don't really think in terms of that. I think I tend to think of my characters more in terms of what's the personality here, what's the backstory, what are their abilities, how would this character react to the situation. And so I do like to think of them more as individuals rather than representations of an archetype. Though I think Rags, in a sense, to me, and I had an early test reader who said this as well, said that she kind of saw Rags as like a force of nature, almost more than a character, which I think is fair, kind of the way she is almost an archetypal little girl, but then there's this extreme violent aspect of her. And again, some of that I think is probably the influence of the anime I like with the the very powerful girls that are often common in that. So maybe you could call that an archetype of sorts. But I think that word or that idea is not what's normally going through my mind as I'm writing or as I'm creating my characters.
Okay. So, can you give us a sneak peek behind the curtain? So, when you were writing this, were there any cool scenes or ideas that got cut for the book that readers might find interesting?
Yeah, the stuff the stuff that ended up getting cut is stuff that I'm going to keep in a dark dungeon where I'll never reveal it. And to be honest, early versions of this story were, I think, extremely lurid, to the point that they were very. I mean, this is about young girls being kidnapped and exploited. I mean, when you come right down to it, that forms a major part of the plot, a major part of the overarching concept here. Some of the early versions were, I thought, it's so taxing to write. They were hard to write, and then looking back over them, I found them disgusting and not the kind of thing either I wanted to read or would want to try to make somebody else read. And for a while, that really, had me kind of depressed about the book, because I thought, this just is not working. But I kind of believe in my main character. I believe in my cast of characters, but the concept here is just not working out. And it was actually at that point, and this seems odd because it's very central to the book, but it was actually at that point I came up with that idea of that gland that produces a drug. And immediately I realized that's it. That's the key to this whole book. I've been trying to figure out how these different parts work together, and some stuff is just too disgusting. And then with that, I was able to not only tie the book together so that it makes sense, but also really take it and tone it down in such a way that it's still bloody, it's still violent, there's still broken bones and whatnot, but where it's really more of an action novel and not something like absolute body horror type of stuff that I just kind of did not want to inflict on the world. So yeah, there was early stuff I don't think is very good. In terms of scenes, though, as in like large maybe chunks of scenes that might have been in the book and got cut. I don't really think so. I think the plot for this first novel I kind of had all at once, and pretty much the whole thing I think went in there. I mean, this initial story, I knew who I wanted to rescue, who had her, and more or less the events that are going to happen there right from the beginning. What I actually had to do was add more things on, because my original version, I was basically throwing too many characters at the reader at once. I realized I needed to back off. I needed to start the story at an earlier point. Like, how does Rags get this information and know where this girl is to go rescue her? I needed to tell that, which also gave me space to introduce all these characters. Originally, it was too much in medias res, I guess we could say, too much starting in the middle, and actually needed some more backdrop first. So really, it was more adding on to the original more than taking away. And then really changing the tone were probably the biggest changes overall from my earliest versions.
Okay, that's a fair assessment. So, what can you tell us about the larger universe? If there's any parts of it that we haven't already talked about, can you give us a hint of those facets?
I'm really fascinated by the idea of the city with a capital C. Like the idea of a city to end all cities, or a city that contains all cities, or something to that effect. I have something similar in Jake and the Dynamo, where that basically takes place in a city where you can practically go to a different part of the world just by taking a bus to the next neighborhood over. This one isn't quite like that, but it's kind of similar in that it's the archetypal city in its own sense. When I started writing this, I already had ideas. It's going to be in some kind of city environment. And my earliest thinking was kind of almost like a vague Blade Runner type of setting. And then it kind of occurred to me, I thought, maybe this is like a religious capital. And then I asked myself, okay, of what religion? And I immediately said, all of them. It's the religious capital for every religion. And I showed some early stuff to a few test readers, and somebody told me I'm kind of getting like an India vibe out of this. And I thought, all right, I'm going to lean in that direction. I was unsure at first, how much did I want to completely make up? How much did I actually want to borrow from, like real world culture? By the time it reached final stage, the Indian elements are unambiguous. And again, it's almost like the Indian subcontinent collapsed into a megalopolis. And so that in a sense is the world. It's this religious center that draws very heavily from different aspects of Indian culture and Indian mythology. There's also, again, because I like adventure stories like set in the British Raj. So there's also kind of a stand-in for the British Empire here, although it's very different. It's this Magitech empire with the demon-possessed technology that is there in the city that was not completely taken it over. They basically own one end of the city, are largely despised by the people who don't like being invaded, and much of what's going on is surrounding this central story of the rescue. There's also a larger conflict. There are terrorist organizations and military maneuvers and all these various things going on in the city, some of which are intersecting with the adventures that our heroes are having.
So, did you curse the story universe with the dreaded IPA?
The what?
The dreaded IPA, the India Pale Ale.
I thought maybe about mentioning those like in a sequel, but nah. If anybody drinks beer, they'll drink better beer than that. Partly,
I appreciate you saying that.
I don't think I have to put the IPA on it because I don't know if this is quite true. There seems to be a lot of lore around alcoholic drinks. You dig a little deeper and find out that the story you've always heard isn't really true. So I don't know if this is accurate, but at least according to what I have read, the IPA was invented because they believed that extra dose of hops that makes it taste like Pine Sol was necessary to preserve the beer in the very hot environment of India. This story is not a historical setting. It's closer to contemporary, although electronic devices don't exist in this alternate world. I kind of think of it as maybe it's maybe the 1980s, or at least that's kind of where I settled for any real world technology that might make its way into the book. But, in addition to the magic technology, so since they wouldn't necessarily have this myth about how beer preservation works and would have refrigerators, they probably wouldn't need to invent the IPA.
That
maybe I haven't really thought about it till now, but maybe IPAs do not exist in this alternate universe. That is entirely possible. I mean, it's often a very dark, grimy world that the story is set in, but you can think of that as one bright spark of hope in the midst of the world of Rags and Muffin, that there are no IPAs.
I approve. All right. So since you mentioned a sequel, Rags and Muffin is clearly a part of a series. It says so on Amazon, but there's currently only one book out.
There is only one book out.
So where do you see the series going next?
Well, I think there's going to be more and bigger adventures. I do have an idea. There's one. There's a insane cannibal cyborg furry who appears in this first novel is going to have a larger role in the second. There's also going to be a mysterious cult that shows up, some new kids on the block, so to speak, who become rivals of a sort to Rags, who are also of a mysterious nature. And some of the mysteries are kind of set up in this first book. We'll begin to get a few of their answers, and also, of course, the larger political conflict of which to which Rags in this first book is tangentially related, and she will become more thoroughly enmeshed in later on. So that is all coming down the road.
Okay. So we know that every literary universe has their own internally consistent rules of science, technology, and magic. So what sort of tech can we expect from these demon-inspired creations?
Well, they have killer robots that are used often as grunts in fighting, and which are very hard to put down. And if you do put them down, they can drag you to hell with them, possibly. They also have giant mechs that are operate in a similar way, although those actually have a human pilot inside, as well as some airships. They have psi blasters that can scramble your brains. So you want to stay out of the range of those. But there are two forms of magic in this. One I would like to actually mention also. There's an illegal form of bomb on the black market that's just actually a very simple demon-possessed machine that's designed to blow up. So it's actually designed to drag people into hell when it explodes. Those are considered a war crime. But there's also the additional form of magic. It's kind of the external magic, the things you can do with the world around you to manipulate it. But there's also the internal form, where through intense self-control and self-denial, a person can, and meditation, a person can potentially begin to gain great powers, and then can apply those to martial arts, basically bending physics, running up walls, punching through concrete, all that good. Again, I mentioned kung fu movies and inspiration here, so all that good kung fu movie types of stuff becomes available to people. And ordinarily, that takes many years to develop, but because of some peculiar and unnatural experiments conducted on rags, she has an ability to do that already as a young child, and even an ability to pass that ability on to others, which is why she has this team of kids who have those same kinds of powers. So that's kind of the internal form of magic in addition to the external. And obviously that's, in addition to the kung fu movies, that's inspired somewhat by the kind of powers that are developed by characters in like the Mahabharata or the Ramayana, who through their self-denial and meditations gain superpowers. So both of those are in there as kind of separate magic systems.
So of all the tech that you invented or magic for this universe, is there anything you'd want for daily use?
I think the demon-possessed machines would definitely be something to stay away from. I invented them as kind of making, how can I make this as terrible as possible? Like, oh yeah, they're going to just drag people to hell. And I absolutely do not think the risk would be worth those things. I would not want such a machine anywhere near me for any reason. So those I would definitely not like to see in the real world. The alternative of being able to jump over buildings or punch through a rock wall could potentially be a very handy ability, although it's also easy to imagine how people could misuse it. So I wouldn't mind having a power like that for myself, I'll admit. I'm not sure if it would be I'm not sure if it would be a good thing for it to be commonplace. I think it might lead to a lot of mischief, and it certainly does in the world of the novel. So
all right. Normally we would ask you how you would use and abuse that, but it sounds like you already alluded to that. So you mentioned that the world has some fantastical creatures in it. So when you go about creating them, specifically Muffin seems like, sort of a fantastical creature, if you would. So when you go about creating these creatures, how do you do it? Do you let your nightmares inspire you? Do you create it out of whole cloth? Do you let biology sort of influence it?
That's tough, because Muffin seemed to come to my mind spontaneously, to be honest. It was almost like as soon as I thought of the title, there was this, it's like the title and the rags and Muffin, like the characters in the title kind of came to be together. The world ended up getting built around them, but they, at least in some form, were there from the beginning. And actually, I don't think Muffin I've modified very much since he first came to my mind. I think, to be honest, for his appearance, probably that anime film Spirited Away, the dragon in that movie, is probably what I was mostly thinking of when I thought of what he looks like, though obviously smaller. But in terms of his ability, his habit of stealing cars, his constantly having a whiskey flask in his claws, and his kind of gruff manner of speaking, I think all of that was pretty much right there and almost spontaneous. The Marjara, the alternate species from the human that humans can interbreed with, I think they were almost also, for this book, largely spontaneous. I first thought of, okay, there's going to be some kind of anthropomorphic cat. What I ended up doing was building their appearance and their fur colors around actually the caste system, as I started incorporating more real world Indian elements into the story. I kind of built their appearances around that. Kind of the variations from one of them to the next is kind of built around that, dependent on what their cast is. So for this book, it seemed like those things kind of just came to me when it came to Jake and the Dynamo, which has a lot more crazy, fantastical creatures in it. A lot of it is just absolutely pulling from anything I can get my hands on, because that's again a kitchen sink story. So it incorporates all kinds of borrowed elements. There's lots of talking animals in that are usually built around some kind of pun. Like there's a magical nun who has a church mouse for her magical companion, and then the main character has electrical powers, so she has a lightning bug, things like that. So in that case, it was oftentimes just simply based around the humor. For Rags and Muffin, I think there's not that many different types of fantastical creatures. And part of the reason for that is I wanted to make the villains, again, with that focus on really mean villains kids aren't ready for. They're also somewhat more real world villains. Although there's a cannibal cyborg guy in there, but the main villain is a pimp and drug pusher, and possibly the kind of person you might very well meet in real life. And I want a lot of the villains in this particular book to be that way. They're really bad people, but they're like bad real people, by and large.
Okay, that was a thorough answer. I will take it. So, obviously, this interview is winding down, but before we let you go, was there anything about Rags and Muffin that we didn't ask that you want to tell us?
Wow, I feel like we've I possibly have said too much, but one thing I would just really say is that I think this attempts to combine kind of two different types of storytelling. On the one hand, it is definitely I hope I'm pronouncing the word right, a milieu story, something that's kind of introducing you to a world, letting you explore. On the other hand, it's really an action story. There's a lot of fighting in the latter half, action scenes that I definitely sweated over to make them as exciting as possible. So I think it's definitely a fast-paced, lots of action book, but I hope it also brings you a world you can really feel like you visited, that you can really feel like you explored for a little while within the pages there.
Okay, that was very thorough. And this is the part of the interview, dear listener, where I remind you that the writing, reading is a two-way street. So please be kind and speak your mind on the reviewing platforms. Your reviews help the right readers find the right books. So do your part. It would be greatly appreciated and helps keep the writers able to keep writing more of those content you absolutely love. Before we let you go, DG, can you tell the listeners how they can find you?
Yes, you can find me especially on my blog. It is deusexmagicalgirl.com. You can also find me on Twitter at D.G.D. Davidson. I also occasionally appear on Facebook, I think under more or less the same name. And those are the places where I am most active. Probably the blog especially. Is the best place to find me, as oftentimes my content on other platforms is simply mirroring what I post there.
Okay, and as usual, dear listeners, will be in the show notes. You can find us on Twitter at twitter.com/SF_fantasy_show. Again, Sierra Foxtrot _fantasy_show. You can email us at blastersandbladespodcast@gmail.com. Again, blastersandbladespodcast@gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook, where all the shenanigans happen, over at facebook.com/groups/Blasters and Blades Podcast. Again, /groups/Blasters and Blades Podcast. You can find us on our website at anchor.fm/blasters and blades. Again, anchor.fm/blasters-and-blades, where you can also support the show for as little as 99 cents a month. You can help keep the lights on. or you can support the show more directly at buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. Again, buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. Be sure to put in the comment section that it is for the podcast, and I promise I will not let my co-host Doc Cisca or Nick Garber drink any disgusting IPA. I'm firmly convinced that only weird hipsters drink it. It's not a real beer. It tastes disgusting. Don't do it. It's right up there with pineapple on pizza on the level of criminality, and clearly shows a level of psychosis. I've said it. You know my email. Bring it. And on that happy note, thank you for spending some of your precious time with us. For Nick Garber and Doc Cisca, I am J.R. Handley, and this was the Blasters and Blades podcast. We'll be back next week at the same time, where we'll indulge our love of nerd culture, cheesy jokes, and all things that go boom.